This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. This is Razib with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and I am here today with David Gress, Dr. David Gress. I know Dr. Gress from his book From Plato to NATO, which I read, I think 20 years ago, a long time ago. It was in my youth. David, could you tell everybody other works and your educational background and whatnot?
Sure. Thanks, Razib. Glad to be here. Okay, I was born in Denmark, so I'm Danish American. And I grew up mostly in Denmark, and then I studied classics, which hence my love of the ancient world, and did a Ph.D. in history. And then I went to the Hoover Institution, where I worked on international security. So it was a big jump from classics and medieval history to strategy and nuclear war. So my first book was a study of military strategy. My second, one of the later books was a big history of Germany since World War II, not World War II, but since World War II, which I wrote with a colleague at the Hoover Institution, and came out just around the time that the wall went down. Okay, moving ahead a little bit here. I then wrote some books in Danish also, and then I got onto the project that you just mentioned, From Plato to NATO, because a publisher thought that I should write sort of, my big take on Western civilization and it's where it came from, where it's going, and so on. So I did that. After that, I've been working at Boston University and since then at a Swiss school. And I've written, since From Plato to NATO, most of my work has actually been in Danish because that's where I live now. So I write books here. I do columns for various online journals and so on. And that's kind of where I am now.
Yeah, that's actually. So I just checked. From Plato to NATO was written in 1998. I'm pretty sure I read it right after it came out. So I would have read it 25 years ago, back when I was a youth. So that was a while ago. But the book made a major impact on me in terms of just So I had read some of the Will Durant series on Western civilization, and Will Durant figures pretty big actually in Plato to NATO. So
it does. He does.
It kind of. Okay, so the way I'm going to tell the listener out there, I was a callow youth. So as you know, David, my background is in STEM, is in biology and chemistry and genetics and stuff. And so, my interest in history is, kind of like I get from Will Durant books or reading books by people like you. It's not necessarily scholarly. So it was a pretty big surprise when I read your book because, I had been taught a particular narrative in the schools in the United States in the 1980s and early 1990s about the origins of Western civilization. And it was basically, we are a democracy. Ancient Athens was a democracy. Maybe they skip over Rome a little bit, but it was definitely, I would say, an ancient Greece-centric narrative. And when I read your book, I realized, oh, wait, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Like listeners who, have like read broadly or like have different political orientations might remember, well, okay, look at how Roman some of our, early Republican public buildings are, or, some of the things mentioned about the rights of the Englishmen. There's more there than simply, Athenian democracy, which is what I think a lot of kids in the late 20th century in the United States were taught. And so can you talk about like what the thesis or basically like the overarching narrative of Plato to NATO? I don't know, I even want to say thesis, but.
Right. Okay. I'll do my best. Going back and reading one's own work after years is often a little bit strange because I would do it very, very differently today. We can get back to that maybe. But okay, my take was, okay, Will Durant, this great historian, he wrote this with his wife, this enormous, like 10,000 page work called History of Civilization, by which he meant Western civilization. And I'm a great admirer of Durant. I translated some of Durant's books into Danish when I was very young, so I don't at all despise his take. But his take is, it begins with the Greeks more or less. Begins with the Greeks more or less, and continues kind of into the modern West after the Renaissance, Reformation, the Enlightenment, the American Revolution, democracy, and so on. It always seemed a little bit too slick to me for two reasons. First of all, well, where did the Greeks themselves come from? Did they just step out of some dimension and invent democracy? And second, what about the Middle Ages? There's this big gap between ancient Greece and the beginnings of the modern world, which kind of gets sidetracked on these sidelines, on these grand narratives. So part of my purpose in that book was to unpack that intervening space, and I came up with two things. One, of course, is Christianity, where, again, the book I would write today would be more overtly Christian than that book was. I mean, I happen to be a Catholic, but you have to read pretty carefully to see that in the book. But Christianity comes in and latches on to, adapt, transforms the Greek and Roman legacy. And then, of course, the thing that many people didn't completely, I think, always grasp was that I introduced the Germanic culture. I mean, the guys who overthrew Rome. And of course, because of historical reasons, I mean, the Germans, the Nazis, Adolf Hitler and all that, people associate any study of the Germanic culture with, bad things like, ethnocentrism and genocide and so on. So I tried to kind of obviate that a bit, but I introduced the Germanic thing because I thought, okay, the Western civilization that we're talking about here is a little bit more than what Durant said. We've got the Greeks and the Romans, sure, yeah. But then we also have the Germanic tribes and we have the Christians. And so I tried to shoehorn that in there. But I wasn't really trying to say that it's wrong to start with the ancient Athenians. I'm just saying there's a lot more to the story than that. And I tried to make the story kind of interesting to a modern audience, which we see now with what's happened since is more and more difficult because the West is being, denigrated and all that. But I was just trying to expand the story a bit and explain that when we have the modern West, with capitalism, democracy, liberal culture, and so on. I was trying to. That's all very well and good, and I'm glad we have it, but it comes from somewhere. And I think we're seeing now that if you forget that it comes from somewhere, it's vulnerable to being torn down and torn apart. And that's kind of was my final warning.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that many Americans, and as you know, I mean, you spent a lot of time here. You are an American in some ways yourself. I believe your son is an American, right?
So am I. I'm a dual national.
Okay,
And
yeah.
so are all my children. I have 3 children. They're all dual national.
Okay. So I should say here, this is a little weird, but I should just parenthetically say I've interacted with your son on the internet, so that's why I mentioned that real quickly.
Which one? The one in Baltimore or the one in Copenhagen?
I think the one in Baltimore.
Okay, yeah, right.
Yeah.
That makes sense, and that makes sense. He kind of vaguely in the same your line of work. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So, in any case, I think, from an American perspective, a lot of the times the way we think of things are, okay, you have these set of rules or, this, like we have a constitution, right? So, you have a set of rules, these ideas, or you have Plato's Republic, which is, obviously mentioned in the book, and then with this kind of set of propositions, you create this republic or this democracy. And I think what I appreciated from Plato and NATO, and it was a little bit more. I mean, I read some more conservative thinkers, so I wasn't entirely alien to me. But you kind of made explicit it's not always just what's explicitly laid out in some law code, and then you can do a copy and paste and just create this civilization out of these explicit rules. Societies and cultures and civilizations evolve organically, and it's a little bit more complicated than just the explicit abstract systems. Is that a right way to say
that's very well put, Razib. Yeah,
Yeah.
being a historian, that kind of thinking comes naturally to me. But yeah, I was trying to explain that things like the American Revolution don't just happen because some guys sat down and think, okay, we're gonna create a new society. It has a long history before it, long rests on tradition and customs, and all these things that certain kinds of liberals don't like to talk about because they're a little intangible and a little bit creepy and irrational. But yeah, customs, traditions, and a really dangerous territory like ethnic descent and that kind of thing. So I wanted to spice the picture up a little bit in that regard.
So you said today you would emphasize Christianity more. I do know you are Catholic. Actually, out of curiosity, so most Danes are Lutheran. How did you become Catholic? Just
Uh, how many hours do we have? No, look, okay, yeah, Denmark is a Lutheran country. Almost no one goes to church, but almost everyone who is an ethnic Dane is baptized in the national church, which is Lutheran. I was not baptized as a kid because my parents were kind of bohemian, intellectual, artistic types and did not believe in baptizing their children. So when I was 19 years old, I went to study at Cambridge in England, and I met students my own age who were Christians. I was completely flabbergasted. I had no idea that you could be a young person and actually have faith. So I began sniffing around at the edges of this, and I read some books that you also may know about, books by C.S. Lewis. Tolkien was very familiar to me from childhood. And so I took the leap after a year at Cambridge, and I got baptized into the Church of England, which I found very congenial. But then after 2 years, I had to leave Cambridge and go to do my postgraduate work in the U.S. And it occurred to me, well, the Church of England is very English. And if I go to America, sure, I can be an Anglican, which or Episcopalian, as you call it, but it wouldn't be the national church. So then I did some more reading, and I had some friends who were Catholic, and so I decided that I was going to do that further step and move from the Church of England to the Catholic Church, which I then did, and then I went to the U.S. A small thing here: I had no idea at that time, because I did not grow up with my natural father, that my natural father's father was actually an Episcopalian priest in New York. I had no idea, but it's one of those funny things where history, comes back and surprises you with things that seem coincidental, but maybe are not. And anyway, that was 50 years ago now, so I've been Catholic ever since.
I see. I see. Yeah, I just wanted to check because I mean, it's interesting. So Americans, as you know, over half of Americans switch their denominations in their lives, which is very strange
Mm.
to people from other parts of the world. And you talk to Europeans, and I have friends from Scandinavia,
Mm.
from the different Scandinavian countries, and at different positions in the religiosity
Mhm.
spectrum, I would say. And it's always Lutheran. I mean, at least for ethnic Scandinavians, Lutheran is the religion they are not, if they are not religious. So I just want to double check.
Right, that's right.
They are,
Absolutely, yes,
yeah.
yes.
I mean, it's like, yeah, they might not be religious, but they will send their kids to the Lutheran daycare or something, which is actually pretty
Right,
common.
right, right. It's like in the old Irish joke, I'm an atheist. Yeah, but are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist? I mean, the culture is permeated by Lutheranism, even though most people don't go to church. That's quite correct. Yes.
So, as a historian and a person pretty deeply steeped in political thought, can you tell the American listener here? About 60% of my listeners are Americans, so I can
Mhm.
address them as a majority. Can you talk about the difference between, say, Greek political thought, which obviously I'm thinking mostly Athenian here because I don't know how much influence Sparta has aside from some rhetorical thing in the modern world, and then the Roman political thought.
Yeah, you asked that question, and I thought about it really all day here because it's a very, very interesting question. Um, Again, if we had a very long time, we could get, but I'll try to make it brief. Obviously, the Greeks and the Romans, and again, you said the Athenians. I would say the Athenians too, um, are obviously very similar. They're both literate Iron Age civilizations, literate, advanced as they could be, with cities, with trade, and all that. Very, very similar. And similar also ethnically, because both the Greeks and the Romans are, of course, basically, largely white Europeans, without getting into all the Indo-European genetic stuff here. But then there are differences. And it struck me, as thinking about this again today, we look at the Greeks, the Athenians, and maybe some of the ones from Asia Minor, the Ionians, some of the early thinkers were Ionian, the first scientists and all that. The Greeks are pioneers. They are the first to think certain thoughts about nature, for example. What is nature? How do natural things become what they are? What is the sun? What is the moon? And their answers, of course, are not scientifically correct, but they're not totally stupid either. So natural curiosity, philosophy is very important to the Greeks. What is the ground of being? Are we made, or are we eternal? Those kinds of thoughts were very Greek thoughts. Now, if you look at the Romans, you don't get that at all. And the Romans were very aware themselves that they were not very, great original thinkers in that regard. So what did the Romans have? They had, of course, the Roman law, which is fundamental. The idea of order, that you can create a political order using reason and some coercion. And later on, when you get up to the time of Caesar and Augustus, of course, the idea of empire. But the thing about the Romans, speaking broadly, is that they always knew that they were secondary to the Greeks. I mean, they understood that the Greeks were, in some ways, way out on in terms of thinking about nature and about society, even about human nature, and of course about the divine. The Greeks pretty much came up with monotheism very early on. The Romans didn't have much, were not very religious people in that regard for a long time. So the Greeks, the thinkers, philosophers, innovators in thought, the Romans, followers, but, very creative followers, because they built this colossal empire using Iron Age technology and kept it going for a very long time. So, those are some of the main differences.
Well, the way you describe it there, I kind of think in some ways, I mean, modern Americans today, I think, emphasize Athenian democracy more than the Roman Republican model, even though, obviously during the founding it was a little bit different.
Mhm.
But all these like abstractions you're talking about, the ground of being and ontology,
Mhm.
it seems to me that the Greeks, they had kind of an integrated, holistic understanding of the world from politics to nature, whereas the
Mhm.
Romans were more pragmatic. And I think Americans are actually more pragmatic. I don't think we think in deep philosophical terms. I think we think in terms of like pragmatism and functionality. And so I think that's interesting because I think our the way we are inculcated in schooling today. Well, actually, I don't know about. Actually, today I don't want to get into that. Let's just say up until about the year 2000. I do have children in the American schools right now, and I don't really want to talk about what they learn because they don't learn anything. But
Okay.
that's a whole different thing. But basically, we are taught about Athens and democracy a lot, and Greece, but Rome is just it's an empire. I mean, yes, there was a republican period, but I think it's a little uncomfortable rhetorically for Americans to grapple with the fact that Rome was an empire. The fundamental reality is I think we are also an empire, even if we're not an empire in name.
Mhm.
Rome was not officially ever a monarchy, but what were the emperors and whatnot. So I guess you have these like rhetorical I don't know, fig leaves or kind of these veils that we put over ourselves. And I think one
Mhm.
thing in America is like we're a lot more Roman than I think modern Americans, late 20th century Americans want to admit.
No, that's quite true. And of course, you mentioned architecture earlier. Washington D.C. is this Roman-inspired architecture is very, very obvious. And of course, yeah, empire is uncomfortable, and so there's been this tradition in American political thought and American debate journalism and so on to deny that. And of course, that creates a lot of problems. And again, when you say that America is actually an empire, and you got to ask, well, whose empire is it? Is it the Democratic Empire or the Donald Trump empire? I mean, that's one of the big splits we have right now in the world today, because America is still not all powerful, but very powerful. I believe we're moving towards a much more multipolar world, but for the time being, sure, America is the most powerful player. And then the question becomes, well, who's doing the playing? And then you get the whole, deep state versus Donald Trump kind of debate. But deep down, it seems to me, from what I read and hear and see, I mean, most of these serious political players kind of agree. The U.S. has the right to more or less control things, and that you can call it an empire, you cannot call it an empire, but it is kind of a de facto empire, and has been, well, since 1945, very evidently, and even before that, if you go back and look at some of the things that were being done earlier. But since World War II up until about now, I think the whole thing is shifting, and the tectonic plates are beginning to look to coalesce in different ways. But up until a few years ago, I would say that the label America as an empire was pretty accurate. Yes.
Yeah, and so the empire, the Roman Empire, is when obviously Christianity came to the fore, and you mentioned your a current treatment would be much more explicitly Christian, and you're right. I mean, from what I remember, it was let's just say it was more Tolkien than C.S. Lewis. Okay,
Right,
in terms of,
exactly. Yes.
I mean, the Christianity was still there implicitly if you just looked, but
Yeah.
it wasn't very salient. So a question that I have is, this might not even right in terms of like you place it later. I don't know, but sometimes people talk about Western civilization, and they say like Western civilization and its roots in Greece, and so it's a little ambiguous whether Greece and like say early Rome before Christianity is Western or not. What would you say, just when talking to regular people? Would you say that pre-Christian Rome and Greece, that they were Western?
Yeah, in a very general sense. Yeah, I mean, I could mention sort of three aspects that certainly go back to there. And one is, the belief in reason, the belief in human reason as being able to interpret the world, and even in a way, build the world, build society, build human relationships. The focus on reason, I think you could trace back certainly to both to Rome and to the Greeks. And the second thing would be the idea of law. I mean, I mentioned Roman law before, but the Greeks also, of course, had a very developed system of laws. And again, something fairly, I can't say unique, because you also have other law codes in other parts of the world, but something that is very consistent over Greece and Rome, and which has survived into the West. And also, I could get back to what I said earlier about philosophy. The idea of philosophy is a Western thing which begins with the Greeks. So, reason, law, philosophy are three aspects of culture that certainly predate Christianity. And you can other things too. I mean, certain aspects of family life, marriage held in high regard, monogamous marriage held in high regard, uh, systems of inheritance. I mean, all kinds of customs and aspects of society that arose in Greece and Rome and survived. I won't say unchanged, but certainly survived into the later synthesis. So the West certainly has roots there, and I would. Well, no, when you ask me that, I mean, I would hesitate to call the Greeks and the Romans Western. I might go as far as say Proto-Western. That might, yeah.
Yeah, because this is part of the question is kind of inspired by Tom Holland, popular historian, has talks about how when he read about pagan Rome, and he dove in his history, he realized that it was fundamentally alien in many ways to his way of thinking, because Christianity had such a huge impact on reshaping the Western mind, right?
Right, yes. No, that's very true, and I'm a great admirer of Tom Holland. I think his work is fantastic and very, very, very useful. He gets these things out to a very broad audience. Yeah, so I just said Proto-Western, but the next sentence would have been, and then it all changes. because there are some aspects of the Greeks and the Romans that are extremely alien. A certain casual violence, exposing children. If you go to Greek and Roman archaeological sites, you'll find these enormous piles of bones, of baby bones, and the bones are mostly girl bones because in those societies, girls were an expense because they had to give a dowry, where boys were an asset because they could gain you a dowry or they could make work for you. So a lot of dead girls, casually thrown away. There's this famous letter. I don't know if you know this quote, but there's a famous letter, papyrus letter found in Egypt, written by I think it was the 1st or 2nd century AD businessman who was traveling, and he writes his wife, and he's very tender letter. You get this feeling of love and affection. I kissed you many times and all that kind of thing. That seems very, 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 very contemporary. But then he goes on to say, okay, if the child you're going to give birth to is a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, throw it out. Just like that. If it's a girl, throw it out. And you think, wow, they weren't really that similar to us, were they?
Mm-hmm.
And there is a counter foil to that. If you go look under the brothels in Pompeii, you find lots of bones there, but they're all boy bones, because when the prostitutes gave birth, the girl could be raised to serve in the brothel, but a boy couldn't. So out with the boy. So baby killing on a massive scale, and that's what Christianity comes in and says, no, you can't do that. That may be one of the really major differences. And of course, the other major difference is the status of women. The way that the Greeks and the Romans were perfectly capable of honoring women, and some of the greatest poetry that you have from Greece and Rome is all about love of women and all that stuff. But the fact of the matter is that women's status, unless you were in the very top level of society, was not an enviable one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it seems like our modern understanding of human rights really kind of. I mean, it's rooted in Christianity. It's rooted in the Christian moral revolution, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I mean,
no question. I mean, yeah, that was a very great seismic shift, which is where the West becomes the West, if you ask me. But again, I mean, it wouldn't, the proto-Western aspects are there. It's just that you had to get over this moral shift in so many aspects of life, and that comes with Christianity. It begins to take effect in the Roman Empire, and then on into the Middle Ages, across what we now call Europe. Yes.
So, I mean, would you say, I mean, so someone like, say, Justinian, who was, obviously very Christian, would you say that, okay, so Justinian kind of crosses the chasm from proto to Western?
I think by his time, we're talking about the mid 6th century here. I think by his time, well, it was ongoing. Yeah, he's a good bridging figure there, because he's still, he's the Roman Empire as the imperator. He's a great lawgiver. His code of law, of course, is still hugely influential in many countries. And he also wants to be the great Christian emperor who intervenes in church affairs to enforce the right belief and punish the wrong belief. He has a pope arrested and deported, and in that way, he demonstrates his power as one who has the right to dictate and control belief. But yeah, no, he is a bridging figure, and by his time, I would say Christianity is probably pretty much universal in the eastern part of the empire, less so in the west. In what is, well, it was no longer within the empire, but places like modern day France, modern day Spain, it was still being a process of growth. But yeah, in his time, you're looking at you're in the middle of the great jump, the great shift.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So and I bring up Justinian because even though he was probably from a Latin speaking background in what is today Macedonia, I believe. I don't want to get into
Right.
the political argument of Justinian's origin, but but I mean, he was the head of at this point like a pretty much a Greek speaking empire. It was going to be like explicitly Greek within 50 years by Heraclius' time. But in any case, so you have like Eastern Christianity, which is not usually. I mean, so there's an argument about this, but it's not usually like Orthodox Christian countries. They're not usually considered Western, really, because they didn't go through. They're not part of Latin Christendom, which in the Middle Ages, like the Muslims would call them Franks or whatever. How do you feel about the East versus West difference here? Because Justinian obviously was not influenced by the Germanic aspect that is, one of the things you introduce in Plato and NATO. So just to be clear for the listener, around like 500 AD, basically the whole Western. Okay, let's put it at 500. Basically, the whole Western Empire, except for parts of Britannia, which was the Anglo-Saxons were in the process of conquering, was under some ruling class that was of Germanic provenance. So you have the Vandals in North Africa, along with their Alanic like subsidiaries. You have Visigoths in Spain, Iberia at this time. In Italy, you have the Ostrogoths. Later, you were going to have the Lombards, and in France, you have the Franks. So every single one of the constituent pieces of the old Western Roman Empire were under the Germans by 500 AD, right before Justinian. And so you're starting to see this split in kind of the roots of what you're articulating from Plato to NATO. And so I was wondering what you think about the Eastern and Western Christian divide and how that influences things.
Oh, big question. Big question. When I was in the process of becoming a Christian, I considered becoming Orthodox, and there are a couple of reasons for that. I had some teachers at the University of Copenhagen in ancient Greek who were very pro. They weren't Orthodox themselves, but they were Lutheran, but they were very pro Byzantine Empire. And then I read about the Fourth Crusade, when in the year 1204, some crusaders, instead of going to the Holy Land, they attacked the Byzantines and destroyed Constantinople, including some of the great works of art that have survived from antiquity, and manuscripts of the lost plays of Sophocles and all kinds of things were destroyed. And I thought this was such a great betrayal of Christianity that I thought, well, I should become Orthodox, because that is the true Christianity. Also because, well, I believe for various reasons that the Catholic Church had fallen away from the origins, and therefore the truth should be found in the Orthodox tradition. Well, I moved away from that belief, but I think, again, the Eastern Christian churches and societies, again, are they Western? Are they not? Depends on who you ask and how you ask it. I think a modern day Greek today would say, yeah, sure, I'm a Western. I'm not an Eastern. I'm less sure about the Russians, and so, I mean, the late Pope John Paul II uses metaphor of the two lungs. Christianity has two lungs: the Western lung, which is Latin Christianity, and the Eastern lung, which is Greek Christianity. There are so many things in Greek Christianity, Eastern Christianity, that are similar but different. I mean, I've been to liturgies in the Orthodox tradition, and it's substantially more worshipful and reverent than most Western masses, be they Lutheran or Catholic. So there's this reverence, there's this great, sense of awe, of worship, and of course they have this whole mystical tradition. Now, the Western Church also has a mystical tradition, but for the last, I don't know, 500-600, I mean, well before the Reformation, the Western Church has become more rational. Believing that you have to prove the faith by reasonable arguments, like St. Thomas Aquinas. You got to reason your way, and human reason is able to arrive at ultimate truth. Where the Orthodox would say, no, that's very dangerous. That's very dangerous. Reason is all very well, cannot be captured by reason, but only by faith and by mystical insights and so on. So there's that huge difference that the Eastern tradition is far more oriented towards the mystical, the ineffable, the symbols, the idea that every physical object is a symbol, and the idea of you have the icons in their churches. The icons are holy objects, not because they're holy, their substance is holy, the wood or the paint, but because what they portray, the divine being, is holy. And there's that idea of the icon as a holy thing for that reason, which you don't have in the West. I mean, sure, in the West we have bits of it, but nothing to the same extent. But again, I would say, like the late Pope said, it is more like two lungs. I would not by any means exclude the Orthodox from Western civilization. I just say, well, they're Western in a different way, and in a way, I think that we need to have much more of, because I think we're in many ways we're in a war of civilizations, and that part of tradition can be very necessary.
So this is outside the purview of this podcast, but I will say one thing. What you're talking about, this generality, other people have observed, like the tendency toward analytical, aspect in the Western Church, and like this mystical aspect of the Eastern Church. But if you look at the list of the Church Fathers, the hyperanalytical philosophical theologians like the Cappadocian Fathers, for example, they're way overloaded towards the Greeks. So it's interesting how from ancient times, like that perception has shifted a lot.
Oh yes, you're right about that. I think it goes to show, I guess, in part that you're talking about the Cappadocian Fathers in the 4th, 5th centuries.
Yeah.
And that was a time when you didn't have this East-West split, so they could be understood and embraced by the Western tradition, because you didn't have this much later kind of idea that the East is mystical and the West is rational. That, of course, is a gross simplification, and always has been.
Yeah. But I mean, that is a simplification that, I mean, has recurred, I think, since the medieval period, in terms of the perception of the Greek Church. And so I guess we're talking about the Eastern versus Western Christians, and going to the West, going to Latin Christianity, which split, obviously in the 16th century, against its own will, arguably, into the Protestant, and let's just say Roman Catholic and non-Roman Catholic, because the Protestant element is very, very diverse and has a really wide range. And some people would argue that there are aspects of the Church of England that are closer to Catholicism than they are to, say, Baptist, Christianity or something, but let's say non-Roman Catholic. So these are the two divisions. And what do you think about the two as being separate civilizations? I don't remember. I mean, people like Huntington, I think he did separate Protestant and Catholic civilization in some ways, but it's not exactly along the religious lines. But I mean, what do you think of them as being two separate civilizations or incipient civilizations? I mean, this is kind of a Sprenglerian way to think about it, but I'm just curious.
Right.
As a Catholic in a canonically Protestant culture and nation, right?
Yes. Well, that's another difficult question, but I think in the bigger picture, obviously they're part of the same civilization, and I think the differences within each group, within the Protestants and within the Catholics, are bigger than some of the differences between the two. In other words, you have conservative Lutherans who are much closer to conservative Catholics than they are to liberal Lutherans, and liberal Lutherans who are closer to liberal Catholics than they are to conservative Lutherans. So it's a very mixed bag. But Lutherans, I know Lutherans best. I know Anglicans somewhat, because I was an Anglican for some years. I was a very high church Anglican, a very Anglo-Catholic Anglican. But I know Lutheranism much better, and the serious Lutherans, if you talk to them about theology and stuff, they are very insistent that they are not and will never be Catholic, because they do not accept, well, of course, the Pope's primacy, that goes without saying it, but there's some very fine points about the theology of the Mass, the liturgy, the Eucharist, that the Lutherans just simply don't accept and will not accept, because to them it's smacks of glorifying human effort and justification by works and not faith and so on. All these things hang together, and so I think it's now exactly 500 years since the Reformation began to bite in this country, in Denmark. 1525, the first major province becomes Lutheran, and that's a long time. And I think through all that time, the cultures have diverged. I mean, the role of the priest, the role of the minister is different. Lutherans now have female ministers and bishops, and a lot of it, going from 7 sacraments to just 2 sacraments, and over time that adds up to a lot. And one other point that people have made, not religious people have made, in Lutheran countries, Denmark and parts of Germany and so on, there is this, people tend to trust public authority in a way you just don't see in Catholic countries. I mean, I won't say the worship of the state, that would be going too far, but the idea that the state is good, the king, the monarch, the prime minister, whoever's in charge, is basically working for the common good, and one should trust them. That's something I just don't see at all in places like, in a country like Italy or Spain or France.
Mm-hmm.
It's foreign to them. Whereas in this country, there is this, sometimes I find rather touching and sometimes rather annoying, innocent belief that the people in charge are, A, know what they're doing, and B, are doing the right thing. And that I think is a very Lutheran kind of perspective to have on public authority.
Yeah, although I mean, not all Lutheran countries are like that. So I think just double checking, Papua New Guinea has one of the highest proportions of Lutherans in the world. So
Really, I didn't know that.
Yes, 20%.
Yeah.
The Evangelical Lutheran Church of Papua New Guinea. So it says it's 18.4% here, because it was under was it German? German.
Yeah, it was German. That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. And so it's Lutheran. Most the 2 largest churches are Catholicism and Evangelical Lutheranism. So I wonder if how some of these things that you're talking about Lutherans are actually, I mean, frankly, just about Scandinavians, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Or like Nordic people in general, because Finns are not Scandinavians. But
right.
One thing that people have told me about Scandinavians is that they're very conformist, where they will turn on a dime really quickly, depending on what their elites say. And for example, Americans are definitely like that, not like that. Just very, very fractious people. Although I do have to say, again, this is like the ethnic confound. You lived in America a lot of your life, and I think you know this too. The Scandinavian Lutherans of the Upper Midwest, they're very orderly people, and they will like stick to an ideology until they won't. And so there's some similarities there that are notable across all of these different peoples. We've been talking about religion a lot, so I do want to mention this. I forget the book a while ago, but I read a book a while ago about Calvinism. And Calvinism, so just for the listeners out there who are not like steeped in the religious, the Reformations, but there's basically several Reformations. The first Reformation is the Lutheran Reformation, and much of like Northern Europe and Central Europe, actually, like there's a lot of Central Europe that was Lutheran, that was re-Catholicized actually later in the 17th century, but in any case became Lutheran. And then in the second half of the 16th century, it became what became called like the Reformed or Calvinist Reformation, the Second Reformation. And you're saying Lutherans are less sacramental than Catholics, but Calvinists are less sacramental than Lutherans. So it takes kind of radical individualism in Protestantism much further, I think, than Lutherans, and the magisterial kind of like the aspect of the church is given a little less importance as opposed to individualism. And like a lot of the American ways of thinking about Christianity and religion, I think, have kind of like Calvinist roots, even if most Americans are de facto Arminian, which means that like they don't believe in all of the Calvinist predestination stuff, even if their churches does, right? But so right. I'm bringing this up in terms of like our modern Western individualism. And also, like, the atheism that's common in much of the West. Some people have said, well, I mean, that's rooted in basically a Calvinist way of thinking, where, just like the saints are gone in Calvinism, and all these other, like, kind of accoutrements around God, around the triune God, and you limit it to the triune God, and then you're just like, well, why not just delete that at some point? What do you think about that sort of line of thinking? This is kind of a Catholic argument, actually, but
Mm,
the person who was arguing it was a Catholic. But
mm,
I'm just kind of curious about what you think about that in terms of this radical strain in the Reformation, this post-Calvinist strain, which I think is pretty much what Americans think of as Christianity, if you actually
mhm.
talk to them.
I think that's very correct. I mean, I think even American Catholics, and when I lived in the U.S., I would, of course, go to local Catholic churches where the mass we almost always in English, and the attitude you got from the sermons and from the behavior was standard American individualism. I mean, of course, there are American Catholics who are very pious and Orthodox. If you go on X, as I do, you find you meet a lot of them. But the basic, ordinary, church going Catholic in America is very similar to the ordinary church-going Protestant. They're all kind of, you say, all kind of Arminian. Most Catholics appear not to believe in much of what church teaches. They don't believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. They don't really believe much in the papal primacy. So yeah, there is this kind of American standard issue personality, which you find in church-going people groups. Again, except for the very pious. Some years ago, the literary critic Harold Bloom wrote a book called, I think I have it right here. It's called The American Religion, like yeah, where he argues that Americans, whatever their labeled faith, Catholic, Calvinist, Anglican, whatever you want, Lutheran, they all share certain core beliefs, and one of the beliefs is self-redemption. In other words, the idea that the individual can, by his own effort, kind of redeem himself and become almost divine. But like a not quite God, but close, right? And of course, this idea of self-improvement and self is classically American. And I think you're right. I think it does ultimately spring from from Calvinist ideas, because Calvinism is a very funny thing. On the one hand, it says most people are doomed to damnation, right? We're lost, but there are those who are not lost, and they will somehow know this by the confidence that they have in their own salvation. So what they're saying here is that if you believe that you are saved, well, then you probably are. And according to Harold Bloom, that then becomes this kind of American idea of you can basically make yourself into God. And he considers the Mormons the most classical expression of that, because of their belief that we're all going to become God sometime. But he
Well, I
says
mean,
it's very general.
righteous Mormon males, just righteous saints, are not all of us. I mean, we
Right.
Mormons are universalists, so they don't generally believe in hell. So people like David, I mean, you seem like a righteous man, but you are not a saint. Therefore, you will go to heaven and not become a
Right.
god.
Right. Okay. Yeah. There's that other level. That's right. Yes. Um, but yeah, so anyway, I mean, your point about American individualism is very well taken, and that's one of the reasons I think that even when Americans and Europeans get along, and right now they're not getting along very well because of all the things we can talk about if not. But there's been this difference that people sense on both sides of the Atlantic, that well, we're kind of all, at least, you know uh, old-fashioned ethnic European stock Americans may look like Europeans, but in many ways they're not. We're one of the reasons that they're different. We're different, and of course I'm schizophrenic here because I have both sides, an American father and Danish mother. But this notion of self-redemption, which strikes many Europeans as either naive or misguided or arrogant, and that's not really what it necessarily is, but that's what it appears to be to people who don't share that belief in that eternal self improvement and self redemption.
Yeah, I mean, it's like emphasizing Max Weber's idea of the Protestant ethic and all that. Americans are are basically like the the biggest I think like examples of that. Like whatever you believe in the details of the, there's like a lot of details in the Weberian thesis, but in the general outline, I think we can see that there is a kind of like a radical Protestant ethos out there in the world, and Americans in some ways are like the logical, final final man. Like, they're like the terminus of that. I don't know how much more individualistic you can get and remain human, as we Americans are, honestly.
That's right. And then I think we don't want to get too off track here, but a huge part of the ongoing culture wars. I still use the phrase culture wars, even though they're no longer fashionable. But a large part of what we see happening is, of course, this individualism is reaching its limit. And what you're seeing now, what I'm seeing now, both in the U.S. and in Europe, is a fairly drastic retrenchment. I mean, you hear people who 5 years ago would have come across as extreme globalists are starting to sound like nationalists, and I find this interesting. My opinions haven't changed that much, but some people have really changed. And in America, what you see, I think, is that many people are realizing, and of course, Trump is part of that, is that extreme individualism, well, it leads to social dissolution. It leads to disparities. It leads to predatory behavior on the part of finance and so on. And people are reacting to that, and that kind of is where the culture war is headed. So the individualism, yeah, it has a natural. It becomes self-devouring, because at the end, what do you have? What does it mean to be American? Right? It's all everyone for himself and do your own thing, and that's all very well, because when that came out in the 1960s, you did have structures to fight against. I mean, there were these kind of conservative ways that I think in many ways were fine, but they were strong. And then you were up against that and broke them down. Now they're all broken down. And then, then what? And what you find is that then what is really nothing or total chaos. And so you're seeing this reaction to that, I think.
Yeah, and that's well taken. Actually, I want to, we've been talking about these deeper historical questions, which I find fascinating, obviously. But let me pivot to Europe. Since you wrote the book in 1998, a lot of things have changed, and some things haven't changed. Your nation, Denmark, actually has changed less than some of your neighbors for various reasons that have to do with political parties that were and were not in power. Do you think that much of Europe is now post-Western due to secularization and or immigration?
That was one of your questions, and yes, yeah. Well, I think what we're seeing here, again, much like the U.S., is basically a split. The societies are splitting. You have the traditionalists, or what do you call them, the patriots, but what do you want to call them, are separating from the what do you call them? The woke, the radicals, the multiculturalists, the globalists. I mean, not physically, because you can't do that. You can't divide countries like that. But or maybe you can. I don't know. But you're seeing a polarization taking place, and of course that's what you would expect, because you have people with opposing opinions. I mean, there are those who say, we have to retrench. We have to re-emigrate hundreds of thousands of Muslims from all our countries because they're alien. They'll never assimilate. And then there are those who say, oh yeah, but they will assimilate. Just give it time. Be nice to them. And what they're doing in the UK is double standards in sentencing. You get a harder sentence if you're a white male, because the white males are the oppressor class and all that kind of thing. I used to be kind of a civic nationalist. That if you're nice, if you guarantee rising prosperity and the rule of law and all these good things, well then, even the most adamant Islamist from the back woods of Pakistan is going to assimilate. Well, I no longer believe that. It's obvious it was an infantile belief to begin with, but and partly because the masses are getting critical. Now, Denmark, for various reasons, is better off than, say, Sweden or Germany or France or England, because we have fewer unassimilable immigrants, and the growth rate in that number is lower. But that's kind of a temporary thing. If you look at the long-term figures, Denmark is going to wind up pretty much with everyone else in my grandchildren's time. But anyway, so you have this split taking place in these countries, and there's this guy in London, a professor, I think his name is Mike Bentz. He says within 5 years you could have civil war in France and England, because the critical mass of unassimilable Muslims is going to become so big. They're already trying to elect their own members of parliament who stands for their interest. They stand for anti-Israel and so on and so forth. And then you have the natives who have been giving way all these years, but are going to stop giving way, because what he says is, this guy Betts, is that you have a formerly dominant group whose status is being threatened. They're being pushed out of the cities. They're getting hit by double standards in the law. Their kids can't buy houses for all these reasons we know about. And at some point they're going to react. But when they do react, they got to come up against a very powerful enemy, namely the unassimilable immigrants, who are very, very well organized, very firm believers in whatever they believe in, and have no intention of going back to Pakistan or wherever. So that scenario is very grim. And the counter scenario to that, which I sort of have to hold on to, is that, well, yeah, but if you can reduce the influx, then maybe assimilation may not be possible, but you can at least keep this extreme polarization from tipping over into outright civil war. So I tend to veer between optimism and pessimism on that score. But I think the division is not just between native Europeans and immigrants from Muslim countries. That's one division. But the bigger division is within the European ethnics themselves, between the globalists and the nationalists, to put it very, very, very briefly. And the globalists control, just like in America, they control higher education, the major corporations, the NGOs, the media, and so on. The churches largely also, which is why we don't see much change in the policy. And then you have kind of the mass of discontented but disorganized people, and that is kind of also a recipe for unrest, if I were to predict it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do have a question in the specific dynamics. I know Denmark. You alluded to it implicitly. I'll make it explicit because we know Denmark has a relatively restrictive immigration policy compared to, for example, Sweden in particular, which is a similar nation in many ways. Sweden is now, it seems, turning towards more towards the Danish model, although it hasn't gone there all the way. But they have a pretty strong anti-immigration party, the Sweden Democrats, who are like a huge minority now in Sweden, and so it looks like that's the wave of the future. And so why was Denmark different here? So let's contrast Denmark to England. Okay, so England, the UK, United Kingdom. Because I was talking to Louise Perry about this. It seems like it seems like the British in particular are exceptional in their lack of political social mobilization around the immigration issue compared to, because you have like the National Front in France, I think you have the People's Party in Denmark. I think that was a party, whatever. In Norway you have similar parties, Sweden Democrats. In Germany you have Alternative for Deutschland. They quote unquote far right parties, but I mean they're promoting, some of them are promoting remigration, like sending people back and all these other things. In England there's nothing like this. In the UK, there's nothing like this. And so do you think there's something, like Louise Perry believes that there's something different with Anglo culture in particular, where they just they will not mobilize in these groupish ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree with her. I know her point of view. She's right. The British, English, Scots, Welsh, Irish, whatever. Not the Irish, but the British are too civilized for their own good. I mean, they colonized most of the world, which I think in many ways was a good thing. I'm kind of in favor of the British Empire, and I'm not one of those bashers. But they are so civilized that then they realize, oh, okay, we got to give all this up because colonialism is not really a good thing. And but we have this kind of civilized, urbane, literate outlook on life, and mobilizing in groups is kind of not done. We don't do that kind of thing. And when people try to do it, like the British National Front, then or someone like Tommy Robinson, who is now in jail, you may know the name. I'm sure you know the name. Then that's they look down their noses. That's kind of vulgar, and you can't. So yeah, I think Louise Perry is right. There is this deeply embedded reluctance to kind of mobilize in your own defense. It's like, it's selfish. It's not nice. It's not cultured. It's not all these things that you. And of course those are qualities, very positive qualities. But the problem now in the UK is that you have these large areas of the country that have become no-go zones for white people and so on. And you have an elite, a governing elite, a media elite, an academic elite that despises its own people. And the people are powerless because, again, if you were to start mobilizing, that's like, frowned upon. There's this one guy that I follow on X. His name is Pete North. His father is Richard North. He wrote one of the best books ever written on the European Union and why it's a very bad thing. But this guy, Pete, has something called the Homeland Party, and he advocates open immigration. I mean, he does exactly what you're not supposed to do. Now, it's a tiny little fragmented party, but he likes to predict that, in 10, 20 years, if they even is still a UK, then that party might actually have some traction. But yeah, your basic point is well taken, and Louise's point is well taken. The British don't like to organize in that way, and I think that's why those kinds of parties, I just mentioned one of them, the Homeland Party, they're going to have a very hard time because it goes against so many values and standards in that culture.
Well, I do think it's kind of interesting, like, from what I know, the English, let's like limit it to the English, which is overwhelming number of British anyway. They go, this sort of like conservative, let's say anti-immigration, which is like it's not just anti-immigration, but this sort of conservative, like right wing, like sentiment. It goes from like Enoch Powell, who, like as you know, was extremely cultured classicist, extremely brilliant man, to Tommy Robinson. It's like there's no middle there. So I mean,
Right.
Enoch Powell is like head and shoulders above in terms of intellect, like any British prime minister since probably Gladstone or somebody.
I agree completely.
Yeah. I mean, those of you who know out there, like British English history, I mean, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know exactly what the measure of Enoch Powell. And then then you have people like Tommy Robinson, or I don't know, like the BNP guy. I mean, they're kind of vulgarians, I mean, to
Nick
be
Griffin,
entirely on. Yeah. And it's just like, this is not going to appeal to the upper middle class burr, the type of person you need to appeal to. So I mean that is something that is going on. Also, I will just say personally, like, I haven't been to the England since 2010, but I did get a feeling being there that they were very open and accepting of having totally separate societies in a way that it just is not acceptable, or was not. I mean, I think it's still not acceptable in the United States. Like you just got the feeling that they were totally open with these people being totally different from the majority and living in a separate world and living totally segregated. And in the United States, that sort of stuff is, that sort of behavior is seen as like, okay, well, that happens in the transition, et cetera, et cetera. But the expectation is you will integrate into the rest of society and like work with other people and eventually, intermarry and all that stuff. That's still an expectation in this country. The whole woke period, even that didn't affect that ultimately. In Britain in 2010, it didn't feel like that at all. It was very notable. And I think 15 years down the line, we're seeing the downstream consequences. And if you look at even if you look at like the social views, the gap between British Muslims, who are, the largest number is Pakistani, and the indigenous like British population, the gap is the largest of all the
Yes.
European countries.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
in France, it's much closer. Even in Germany, the Turks are much closer to the Germans. And so England in particular is creating itself a massive problem. The only thing that I always wonder about civil war in terms of all candor is that, like, these people don't serve in the military. I mean, that's one of the things
No.
with British Muslims. There are more British Muslims in ISIS than in the British military.
That's
So
right. That's right.
I do think if it comes to arms, like, they will be in for a surprise. But
Yeah, I think that's right. My thought exactly. Which is one of the reasons why it may not happen. But yeah, the thing about parallel societies is also very British. Yeah, I mean, my daughter lived in London. She's married to an Englishman, and that's kind of his view. Like we can't really change it. Remigration isn't possible. And Nigel Farage says you can't do it, so you can't do it, and even he said you can't do it. So yeah, they're here to stay. They're having more kids than we have at a much faster rate. Don't think about that. Let them have their enclaves. Let them have their zones, their parts of London, their parts of Birmingham, their parts of all the other cities, and let's hope it works. I mean, that's a very British, a very English way of thinking, and I think you're right. It's very prevalent. Yeah.
so you're in Denmark now. So the European Union, you're part of the European Union, right? But you still have
Yes.
your own currency, correct?
Yeah, but it's tied to the euro, so it's kind of not
De
really our own
facto.
currency, but yeah.
Pegged. Okay. Okay. So one of the things. Okay. So there was, before the Reformation, right? I mean, so there's this whole argument that nationalism, which I think is a little overdone, but like, Protestantism and nationalism and national identities kind of went together, and the Reformation was kind of like a shattering of a Christian commonwealth that kind of existed before. And the European Union in some ways is a little more expansive than that, than just Latin Christianity, obviously, with the Balkans and whatnot. But the European Union is kind of like a recreation of this supranational state. And here in the United States, we do have that. We have, like 400 million people across like most of half of a continent, like, Canada exists, whatever.
Mhm.
And so we have this big free trade zone, free movement zone. Traditionally Americans used to move a lot. They move a lot less now. That's a whole separate podcast. But in the European Union, you were supposed to create these synergies. Well, it doesn't seem like it's happened, because the reality is Spaniards like living in Spain, and they're not going to go move to Germany where there's
No.
jobs, right? So do you think the European Union project has failed, or do you think it can be salvaged? Like, what's going on here?
Well, very briefly, I mean, I've written a book about this also. I mean, the European Union project. Well, see, what is that? It's the official answer is a peace project. After World War II, Germany and France reconcile, work together for the common good instead of working against each other. Join the industries, join the markets, and you get a common currency area, common trading area, and you have all these good things. But if the agenda really was something else or something additional, for example, a super state, that was never going to happen. And I think what you're seeing now happening in the European Union is that this tension is coming to the fore, because they have the European Union elite, the top people, Ursula von der Leyen and all those people. I mean, they're gung ho for war against Russia. They want to they want to get rid of the finance barriers to common spending, and they want to increase censorship. I mean, that is a super state sticking its head out, which the vast majority of people don't want. I mean, people, if you ask the ordinary Dane, is the EU good? He'll say, yeah, the EU is good for Denmark because look, we have free markets, we can sell anywhere and so on. But when you actually point out what they're really trying to do with all these super state like measures, then the picture changes. And I think it was never going to work as a super state. There always were these two spirits in the EU: the spirit of free trade, liberal capitalism, democracy, and then the spirit of the super state, actually very much communist inspired. It's going to take us far too long. We have to close them. But one of the founding documents of the European EU movement was a document written in 1941 by some Italian communist political prisoners, and it's very explicit. They're advocating a super state where the economic power belongs to the state, the super state, and not to the people and not to the countries. So there's this double thing in the EU, and I think it's coming to the fore now, and it's going to have I don't think the EU will exist in anything like its present form in 10 years. I really don't. I don't see how it can.
Well, I mean, so as we're closing out, I guess, like, you've been talking for a while about like Western civilization.
Mm.
Obviously, the West, Europe. I mean, I consider the United States part of Western civilization, and there are arguments about Latin America, but I mean, its elite culture is all Western.
Hmm.
Whatever the popular culture is, its elite culture is either Roman Catholic or Protestant now in some areas, and Latin American intellectuals have traditionally looked to Europe, in terms of its elite thought, whether it's Marxist or or positivism and all these other things. So, you have this whole, like, and you have Australia, obviously, and then, in some ways, all of modern culture, all of elite modern culture is Western, right? Like, at least at the top, at the surface levels, with liberal democratic systems. Even the People's Republic of China is a quote republic. It's not really, but whatever. But in terms of Europe, what are your I mean, I know you've gone between pessimism and optimism in this podcast. So, what are your thoughts on the prospects for Europe? Do you think different parts of Europe have different prospects? Like, part of the issue here is, and we can't get into this in this podcast. The fertility collapse is just
Right,
crazy.
right. Yeah.
And so, part of the issue that I have with Europeans complaining about immigration is just like, I mean, you can complain about immigration, but like when your fertility, like in Spain, is sub 1,
Hmm.
um, I mean, I don't really understand like how this is going to sustain unless you want to be, have robot servants in the very near
Yeah.
future. That's the only
Like
way that you
yeah,
can.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like in Japan. Japanese seem to be doing okay with that robot model. But the thing about that is, yeah, you're absolutely right. Um, the birth rates are terrible. Uh, of course, they're higher among conservatives, but they're not very many of those. So overall, that's very grim. But immigration is not really a solution because what if the people come from countries, and I'm going to use a very dangerous word here, where their average IQ is 80 or 85. I mean, it's not going to work. So the problem is that the Europeans are becoming extinct, and that's the pessimist part. The optimist part says, yeah, but there's going to be enough of the high fertility minorities to kind of keep things going. So I don't know. I have to say the future is very I won't say dark, but varied,
Cloudy.
muddled,
Let's
cloudy.
say
Yeah, cloudy.
cloudy. I mean, hopelessness is a sin, as they say. So you never know what the future holds, and you are a religious person, so there's a plan in there somewhere, right, David?
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been great talking to you, great catching up with you.
Hmm.
I've obviously enjoyed that book. It's one of my, I do recommend From Plato to NATO to everyone out there to read it. It's, I don't know if it's out of print or not, but I'm sure you can get a copy somewhere. And it's a very,
Yeah, it's like print on demand. You can order it; it'll print on demand.
okay. And,
Mhm.
it was a very enjoyable read. Like I said, I'm not from not trained in classics or history, although I have read a lot of history books, and it was a very easy to read book.
Well,
Well
thank you.
written. I think you were aiming it, I think, more to a general audience, but still, it was at a high level. Is
Yeah.
what I will say. I,
Mhm.
I'm gonna say, like, there are certain popular history books where I'm like, look, don't treat me like a child. Like, I mean,
Mhm.
I'm an adult. I can read like complicated things. I think your book did not treat me like a child. And it was, that was well done. So I really do appreciate that. And obviously, like, there's much more we could talk about. Maybe we'll do a future podcast more on
Mhm.
contemporary issues.
Mhm.
But I think to actually understand and fully appreciate contemporary issues, you do have to know the past. And so that's why I really wanted to talk From Plato to NATO and your understanding of these historical processes, because I think that's how we can understand. That's how we can best prepare for the future, understand the past to situate our present. Right.
Right. Right.
All right. Well, it was great talking to you, David,
Mhm.
and I will see you online.
Thanks, Razib.
This podcast for kids